Well, welcome back to week one, lecture three of our 6323 course in apologetics, and we are going to continue on in the Guinness book here together in this session, just a little bit more. But I want to do something before I jump back into Guinness, and that is to introduce another book to you. And this is the book right here. This book is in the supplemental reading section of your syllabus. It's by Colin Brown, Philosophy and the Christian Faith. It's an older book. It was written, I believe, in around 69 or 70, 71, something like that. So it's been around for a while, and Colin Brown was a prime evangelical scholar. He was an Englishman and wrote many helpful books, but this probably has been the most helpful of his books for those of us who are sort of laymen when it comes to philosophy. And even if you have taken courses in philosophy, or if you perchance have a major in philosophy, it's a helpful book to go back to. Now, I've not put it on the required reading because we can only require you to read so much, and I think I'm probably at the maximum level already this semester. But with all of that extra time that you have on your hands, I might recommend to you to follow along in the assignments in the reading of the Colin Brown book. It's very, very helpful. And his explanations of philosophy, he follows a kind of historical perspective, are very clear and lucid. And so I think that even though we're not reading it necessarily in conjunction with the exact issues we're dealing with in this course, that a refresher can be accomplished through this little primer. So I want to recommend the Colin Brown book to you. Now, and I'll mention it again from time to time if there's something especially relevant for today's lecture. Now, we're looking at chapter 3 of the Guinness book, and I just have to say, every time I come back to this book, that I really, really like this book, and I hope that you like it. It's very readable. Guinness writes in very readable style for a guy with a doctorate from Oxford especially. And he always begins with something that's nice and anecdotal. He does that with particular characters out of the works that Dorothy Sayers wrote in her novels. And so the introduction to this is quite appropriate. And one of the things that's kind of unique, I say kind of because I've not stumbled across it anywhere else, but somebody else may have written in this area, is that he spends almost the entire chapter looking back to Old Testament examples of apologetics. And I found that fascinating. After I read this chapter the first time, I wanted to give it sort of a little special acronym. Always be doing apologetics, ABDA. And so if you want to write ABDA in the chapter, over the chapter heading of chapter 3, well, I wouldn't mind, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't mind. And that's kind of what he's getting at here, that we find apologetics in the Bible in places that we might not expect. And in fact, in the history of Western literature, you would find it also. I recently reread Robinson Crusoe, something I probably hadn't read for 50 years since I was a little kid. And what I saw in the book this time that I think I missed the first time through was the absolute dedication that Crusoe had to God. Not initially. He spent several years alone on the island before that took place, but he had a Bible with him when he was marooned there. And of course, eventually he makes a friend, a young native boy or young man named Friday. And in the course of the final chapters of the book, there's a kind of an apologetic that's taking place throughout the book. And so you sort of do apologetics where you are. And if we're always thinking in apologetics terminology or concepts, then I think that's a very helpful way to think about life. Now, there's a caveat, and we'll get to the caveat before we're done here. But he starts here looking at Hebrews 11, the hall of faith, as we've all heard it taught and preached before. And then he bounces out of that and goes into a number of Old Testament texts. First of all, Eve in the garden. And essentially what he argues here is that the tempter came to Eve, the serpent came to Eve, And the serpent did not immediately try to say God won't or God didn't or God can't. He just raised a question. There's an interesting little quote in here where he talks about sometimes questions are more subversive even even than direct statements. And that certainly, I think, was the case in the situation with Eve in the garden. The tempter, the serpent, raised the question. And by the way, that quote is on page 52. Questions are always more subversive than statements. And it's one of those things you can kind of think about maybe in your quiet time sometime this week. So he looks at this first. And very interesting discussion. As a theologian myself, primarily reading exegetical material and theological explanations of the fall, it's kind of interesting to look at the explanation of the fall that comes from somebody who does apologetics and whose life has been dedicated to that for decades and decades now. Interesting analogies he draws on the whole issue of blaming God, which is essentially what the tempter did. He raised the question about God so that he might blame God for Eve's current situation. And then he goes on to make the point that this is what we do. Even people who don't believe in God blame God. I remember many years ago I had a cousin who took his own life and with a pistol. I was a seminary student in Fort Worth, Texas at the time, and my family lived in Colorado. And so I went back for the funeral, and my aunt and uncle and their only surviving son, my cousin Dwayne, asked me to lead at least part of the funeral. And of course, I'm 22 or 23 years old. I've never been at a funeral before, at least not as someone who led the funeral. And I remember when I first walked up to the place where they were all meeting ahead of time to talk with my aunt and uncle and grieving cousin and the rest of the extended family who were all there, all of whom are Catholics, but most of them nominal. And in this case, my aunt and uncle were, to all effects, agnostics. Never heard anything spiritual come from them, nothing biblical. My mother was the only one. There were 4 sisters who were siblings in the family. My mother was the only one who became a Christian out of that family. And so we had this conversation. And they wanted to ask me the question, why did God allow this? And I remember then my first inclination, being a little bit of a snippy fellow as I was as a young man, my first inclination was to ask, why would you ask me that question? I don't even know if you believe in God. But of course, I had enough pastoral training by that point to know that that was not the case, and enough humanity, I would guess, also, to know that that was not the question, or that was not the answer to give. And so we did the best we could with the terrible situation. And he sort of lives in that realm here. He says, look, we all recognize, even those of us who believe in God, that there's contrary evidence out there. The suffering of children, the murder at My Lai, which is one of the issues he brings up in the chapter here, the multiple murders at My Lai in Vietnam. All these other things, there's contrary evidence. But we have become believers, not just in God, but believers in Christ, because we believe that the overwhelming positive evidence for God and for Christ is there, and that even if we have to stumble at times in trying to explain what the philosophers would call the problem of evil and suffering, we can kind of get through that. Well, he takes the readers here through several examples in the Old Testament, David and Goliath. And the David story is one where he transitions to the final things he wants to say. In many ways, the last 4 pages of this chapter are the best. When David stood before Goliath, he said, "This is so that all the nations may know that there's a God in Israel." And if that ain't apologetics, I don't know what it is. That's apologetics. David was in some ways there for an apologist. Talks about Rodin and the thinker, and I'd never noticed this before. I've heard that Rodin was that he crafted the sculpture on the thinker as one who was contemplating souls going into hell. But he has this interesting little quote from Rodin here on page 57. What makes my thinker think is that he thinks not only with his brain, but with his distended nostrils and compressed lips, and with every muscle of his arm, back, and legs, and with his clenched fist and gripping toes. And then I have a little copy of that as a bookend. I looked at it when I read that and I said, you know what, that guy's engaged, and that's why I said always be doing apologetics, because we always should be engaged. We read Robinson Crusoe, or as I'm doing right now, Henry James, The Return of the Native. We're always doing apologetics. But the last 4 pages, I want to say something about that and I'll be done, which he calls his own best counsel, is that God is the supreme counsel for the defense. There's coming a day when the court will be over, and that's the judgment day. He talks about how sometimes we feel like it's our responsibility to defend God. And of course, in apologetics, to some degree, that's what we're doing. We're doing theodicy, justification of God, a term we'll run across a little more later in the semester. But he makes it very clear here that God is the one who can defend himself. And I'm going to conclude this by reading a quote at the top of page 58. But faith in God is true because it is true, not because we or David, Elijah, and Luther defended it successfully. If the Christian faith is true, it is true even if no one believes it. And if it's not true, it is false even if everyone believes it. The truth of the faith does not stand and fall with our defense of it. And I think that that's exactly right. It's a warning, it's a caveat for those of us who think that we have the responsibility to convince people of the faith. Our responsibility is the responsibility of a witness. So let's be witnesses. And let's do more than just read apologetics this week. Let's always be doing apologetics.